This is part one of the Sword and Pen series, in which we profile the lives of now obscure American heroes who may possibly be ideal role models for future generations who seek to combine intellect with action. Since the beginning of the last century, such philosophers as Wyndham Lewis and Yukio Mishima have alluded to the fact that art and intellect have been separated or starved of action. And we think of the separation of scholarship from action, as Thucydides said, your wise men will be cowards and your fighting men will be fools. And in today's society, we have, of course, the old stereotype of the nerd versus the jock. The idea of a cultured brute has been largely disregarded. Instead, we have the stereotype again of the strong but dumb individual and the pencil-necked, four-eyed weakling who is also very intelligent. Both these human cliches are uniquely American in that they are both devoid of any moral or cultural refinement. So you can have an intelligent individual who is still not availing himself of the finer things of life, so to speak. And obviously, his brutish counterpart is doing the same as well. It's open Philistine. You know, Clemenceau said America went from barbarism to decadence without having a period of high culture in between. America is exceptional in the fact that it has had a gilded but never a golden age. And from this gilded age emerged the middle class fear of a certain type of individual, a gentleman of good morals and character who is cultured and capable of being both scholar and poet, as well as politician and killer. Consequently, you don't really see this figure in contemporary society. However, it was the late Jonathan Bowden's contention that only such an individual, which he termed the cultured thug, could extricate us from our current predicaments. And so it's my intention to profile such a man tonight, John S. Rip Ford. And it's my opinion that Ford is the best role model for those, again, seeking to merge intellect with action. While he's virtually forgotten today, Ford was a leading figure and champion of old Texas in each of its tumultuous and transitory periods. Rip Ford was an influential figure when Texas was a republic, when it was a state, and later an occupied territory during the Reconstruction period. He was by turns a doctor, a lawyer, surveyor, politician, journalist, Texas Ranger, Confederate general, mercenary and filibusterer, and finally a historian and writer. Now, there are no movies and few books detailing Ford's exploits today. There's never been a movie made about Ford's life, but there have been many films featuring characters who might have been based on Ford and his life. And these characters are always in the villain's role. He's very much the opposite of the stereotypical Western hero who is antisocial and individualistic, somewhat scruffy often, and frequently disillusioned by life. Ford is deeply ideological and political. He's frequently defeated but never demoralized. He always comes back stronger than before, as we shall see as we go through his life. But today, he'd undoubtedly be a Hollywood villain. He's the nemesis of every character Sam Peckinpah ever created. He's a bigot and a Bible thumper. He even teaches Sunday school. And again, we know Ford today is known for being a Texas Ranger and a Confederate general who fought the very last battle of the Civil War. Stand Watie is known as the last general officer to surrender his command, but Ford fought the last actual battle of the Civil War. In the past few years, we've seen the reemergence of the low budget Western with these same tired characters, world weary, antisocial, devoid of higher purpose. And the reason of these kinds of films get made is that people who fund them know there is an increasingly small number of heritage Americans who will watch anything Western, and these films can be used to further facilitate their demoralization. So their background, individuals like Ford are not popularly known because their stories have been suppressed, and that's why it's my intention to bring his story to the forefront. Ford begins his memoirs with the prologue entitled My Fighting Stock. He's descended from Scotch-Irish pioneers, in that he's similar to James Webb, who wrote Born Fighting, A History of the Scots-Irish in the United States. Now, like all products of miscegenation, they have both virtues and vices, and they are primarily known as pioneers. Pioneers are known as those individuals who are the vanguard of a military force in the old days. They went ahead and built the roads and suffered the slings and arrows of the enemy harassment parties who were preventing them from going forward. In the United States, they're known for going forward and pioneering and settling the country. They're bred to be pioneers, and if they're not pioneering with a purpose, they're undergoing collective ethnic deterioration. They need that activity, the action, they need to be needed. Now, Ford's ancestors are his heroes, and throughout his life, he seems to want to live up to their legends, and by doing so, he creates his own. His grandfathers served in Virginia, and they also served in the Carolinas during the conflict between the Continental Forces and the Tories, where it was particularly vicious guerrilla warfare. There were individuals like Thomas Sumter and Francis Marion who were waging a kind of military operation that was not dissimilar to that of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And there are individuals who became famous in American history, like Andrew Jackson, who would later become president, and Jack Sevier, who would become the first governor of Tennessee. This is where they earned their spurs in the early days, as Marquis James describes in his book, The Border Captain. Now, Ford was born in 1815 and grew up on a small Tennessee plantation. As a child, he was known as a prodigy, finishing school in only 5 years. He was a wild and reckless young man, and the elderly locals said he was born to be hanged. And of course, today he'd be put on medication for ADHD, but at that time he was recognized as being a quick study. At the age of 18, he began to study medicine. He worked under a doctor. He was basically apprenticed at that period of time. And being a quick study as he was, in the period of 1 year, he had almost completed his medical studies. One of his jobs was tending the sick, in which case he was early on volunteered to tend a smallpox patient. And he and one other individual began to tend the smallpox patient. The other attendant contracted smallpox and passed away. Ford and the patient both survived, Ford without ever contracting smallpox. So this was a period of time where if you were diligent and studious, you could get ahead in a very limited period of time. Now we have the medical system ensconced as it is in Comtean positivism and ethics, and so consequently today you're forced to study for as long as, under a compulsory amount of time. You can't finish your courses ahead of time. And so fortunately for posterity's sake, and the society of his time put no governor on natural drive and ability. So Ford, very early on, was actually engaged in a brain surgery operation at the age of less than 21. Under the age of 21, he had to perform brain surgery, which he did successfully. And again, this was a time in which hard work was not denied or stifled. Sam Houston, a contemporary of Ford's, one of his heroes. He studied law for 4 months and successfully passed the bar. It wasn't matter how long you studied for. You could study for 8 years to pass the bar. You could study for 4 months, which Houston did. So again, that's a time when youth and vitality were necessary. And so in all the professions, and younger men who applied themselves, they were rapidly saw a good rate of return for their efforts. John Stuart Mill, for example, began to read Latin and Greek at the age of 6 and went to university at the age of 12. So this was not uncommon in Ford's era. Ford was not overly satisfied with the practice of medicine, however. His interest primarily was moving on, more interested in the idea of the frontier and settling new areas. And so when the struggle in Texas began, Ford was living in Tennessee. A lot of Tennesseans under David Crockett had gone to the Alamo and been martyred there. Effectively, if you were a Tennessean, you felt that Crockett had been martyred. And so a large number of Tennesseans were beginning to muster themselves to go to Texas to fight and avenge Crockett and potentially avail themselves of the vast territory to gain land and property and distinction at this period of time. So where we're going to leave off tonight is Ford's beginning his career as a volunteer traveling to Texas to be a part of the initial Texan War for Independence. And we're going to leave it there. I'm going to put most of this behind a Patreon paywall or some form of pay in the near future, because you have to understand that there's very little content available on Ford. And the reason there is very little content on Ford is, as I said, he is suppressed as people do not want such a figurehead to emerge. I mean, we can look into the pages of history and see many such figures, but they don't matter for the most part because people are always rediscovering history. This is not a new situation. History is always reemerging. It's always vanishing and it's always coming forward for the most part, and brings us to a time in which the return of history is necessary to recognize. And the one book about Ford is his own memoirs, which are heavily edited. They were originally 1,200 pages, and they were edited by a professor, and they suffer from what I would consider suppression by curation, what I would call it, by the academic who is a self-confessed Marxist as well as a known plagiarist. And this individual, I feel, is the preeminent scholar on Ford. And the other book on Ford, again, these works are not well known and certainly not in any way promulgated by any side in the issue. So the money I intend to raise, if any, to continue on this procedure of bringing out these works on Ford is going to go through to getting original documentation, which I've done before at University of Baylor in Texas. Obviously, there will be other university archives that you basically have to explore yourself. You can't, if you're wanting primary sources like Ford's letters and so forth and so on, that's where you have to start from. Now, Ford had quite an illustrious career, which we're going to go into. I want to talk about his background as a member in good standing of these various organizations and various Confederate generals, so forth and so on, the Texas Rangers. He flirted with joining the Knights of the Golden Circle, and we're going to talk about all of that in the future. But I'm going to conclude this broadcast right here. There will be a means of contributing to further broadcasts, and I'm going to put up the next installment, a link to the next installment, but it won't actually be available unless there's some funding provided. So if you're interested in getting future updates of these broadcasts, you'll have to message me and get in touch with me and contribute generously. So without further ado, I'm going to close this broadcast.